My name is Taylor Stewart. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Remembrance Project. I help communities in Oregon with truth and reconciliation projects about repairing historical harm, with the idea that while we can't change the past, we can always change our relationship to the past. And that there are things we can do to rewrite the ending to stories of historical injustice. And so that's been my work here in Oregon, is connecting the historical racism to its present day legacies in order to inspire contemporary racial justice action. There's actually a quote from Bobby Kennedy that I really like. Some men see the world as it is and say why. I dream of things that never were and say why not. And so it's that, how can we ask why not for some of these projects? And what brings me to this work is my own personal journey. I have the belief that we lose hope when we stop believing individuals and communities can change, so I choose to remain hopeful. The interesting part of my racial justice work is that I graduated high school a registered Republican with the dream of becoming a tough on crime prosecutor. And so to be able to see my own transformation from learning and experiencing this history is, that's what inspires me to try and do for others what was done for me. And really, I've always been passionate about justice. The only thing that changed was my understanding of injustice. And so when it comes to the death penalty, seeing the disproportionality and its connection to the history of lynching, realizing that there is no justice unless there's equal justice. Equal justice under law is what it says on the Supreme Court. But the system that we depend upon to dispense the most ultimate form of justice is too flawed to produce anything but injustice. And so for me, it is, when I work with these communities, it's not getting them to see new values, but getting them to see the values they already have in a new way. And so people want to create, and so when it comes to the sundown towns, people want to create a community in which their neighbors feel safe, respected, and like they can call that space their home. And so that's our baseline thing that we're shooting for, but realize that there are things we need to do collectively related to our history, related to our present, to actually create a community in which those ideals can be true. Yeah, so it's called the Sunrise Project, with the idea that sunrise is the opposite to sundown and signals the start of a new day. Our tagline is from sundown to sunrise, and right now I'm working on an educational resource about what sundown towns look like, both nationally and locally, how that exclusion evolved into the present, and then the next steps a community can take to building a more inclusive environment. And included within that is an oral history component, collecting the first-hand memories of those who remember sundown towns in their community, both from the white perspective, as well as African Americans who remember having to navigate sundown towns in Oregon. When I tell older African Americans from the Portland area that I'm traveling to Coos Bay or Grants Pass, they without fail always ask me two questions. How many people am I going with? And am I carrying? Because even in 2022, those questions are still on the forefront of their minds because of Oregon's history of fear and intimidation towards Blacks. And so collecting the experience of sundown towns to get the history, the effect, but also the resiliency that African Americans have shown having to navigate this history. And so starting in the community of Grants Pass, Oregon, Grants Pass infamously had a sign within the community that said, "Nigger, don't let the sun come down on you here." And in 1970, Grants Pass was 99% white. Today, Grants Pass is 0.8% African American. And so our present day racial demographics can be explained by our histories of exclusion. I was reading a book from an African American man who was retelling his experience living in Grants Pass during the early 2000s. And he mentions on his second day being in the community, going into a hardware store and being in the checkout line, and one of the managers from the hardware section was talking to a gentleman behind him, and he's like, "Harold, keep your eye on this one right here." And the guy behind him was like, "Yeah, these people are always stealing." And so this gentleman, his name is Dr. Robert Jackson. The man has a PhD, but coming into this community, he was there, that's not what they saw him as. They just simply saw him as a Black man, who they attributed to this legacy of criminality. And so this presumption of guilt and dangerousness was placed on him. And this is the way that he was treated in the 21st century. He mentions playing basketball at one of the local parks. And throughout the 2000s, he was like, yeah, the last time it happened was like 2013, where people would just drive by and yell racial epithets at him. And he would play at the basketball court away from the street just to sort of decrease the hostility of the man was simply just going out and playing hoops. But this hostility and this inability to integrate people of color into the society is a remnant of that sundown town, that purposeful exclusion. And so I believe that in order to create these better communities, this vision of a sunrise community, we have to deal with the history of sundown towns to explain why there is the cultural racial climate that exists in these spaces today. Yeah, so it's called How Do You Reconcile Lynching? A Story of Justice and Redemption. I'm talking about my experience memorializing a man named Alonzo Tucker, the most widely documented African-American victim of lynching in Oregon. Alonzo Tucker was 28, married, and a boxer from California. And he was lynched in Coos Bay, Oregon in 1902 after being wrongfully accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. Before he was eventually hung from a light pole on the old Marshfield Bridge in front of a crowd of 300. And so this is about the story of how that within this question, how do you reconcile lynching, are the 3 R words of remembrance, repair, and redemption. And then in order to get to that last R word of redemption, we need to have the courage to undertake the first 2. And so for 3 years, I worked with the community of Coos Bay on that remembrance section. In 2020, we held a soil collection ceremony near the spot of the lynching, where we collected 2 jars of soil, one that was sent back to a museum in Montgomery and the other that is now on display in the community. And then in 2021, we unveiled a historical marker in the community to memorialize Alonzo Tucker and the thousands of other African Americans who were lynched in this country. And what was numerically significant about the historical marker unveiling was that we had 600 people, both in person and virtually, sort of paying witness to this story. And that being significant because that was double the number of people who were at the 1902 lynching. And so Alonzo Tucker's story doesn't have to end in 1902. It can now continues on into 2020 and 2021, when that same community where his lynching occurred used his memory as inspiration for becoming a community more committed to the ideals of truth, justice, and reconciliation. And so that was the remembrance part. And now that we've done that and we have an understanding of our history of lynching in the state of Oregon, we have to look at the way that lynching continues today. And so we need to repair the fundamental question of who our society believes deserves death, because the answer continues to be people that disproportionately look like me, like Alonzo Tucker. And it's the value of all African Americans, the value of our lives are tied up in this question of who our society believes deserves death. And so it's about transforming the threshold question in Oregon from, does this person deserve to die for their crimes, to, do we deserve to kill? And I talk about the fact that Germany doesn't have the death penalty, that it would be unconscionable for the country of Germany to systematically execute its citizens, especially if a disproportionate number of those citizens were Jewish. The world would be in outrage. We in the United States would be outraged if that were the case. Yet there isn't that same outrage when, given our history, the United States systematically executes its citizens, and a disproportionate number of those citizens are African American. There isn't an outrage when, given our history as a state, a disproportionate number of African Americans sit on Oregon's death row. And so doing this TED Talk to sort of create that outrage, that we need to be outraged over injustice. And to get people to, I was so inspired by a John Lewis quote of, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? And so creating that fierce urgency of now about this issue is what I'm hoping to accomplish with the TED Talk. You know, my whole thing is I can't change the whole criminal justice system. That was one of the things that really came about in the post the 2020 protests, of our criminal justice system isn't quite so just. And I believe that just because you can't change the whole doesn't mean you can't change a part. There's a quote from New Jersey Senator Cory Booker that I really love of don't let your inability to do everything stop you from doing one thing. And so because I can't change the whole legal system, I can try and make a difference in this one aspect of it. And that's the sort of attitude that I hope I can inspire other people with, of just because you can't change this big thing doesn't mean you can't change a small little part. And it's really all about just finding that one thing you can do. Then you'll be surprised when that one thing grows and grows and grows. I was just a random college kid that filled out an interest form online. And then my life completely changed just because I did that one thing at the very start. I believe that we have to create collective power in Oregon as African Americans. We make up such a small portion of the state's population, but that doesn't mean we can't still have a mighty voice. And so it's about creating collective power in our dispersed sections, even in Portland, the largest population of African Americans. We're still dispersed because of our history of redlining, gentrification, and displacement. And so it's about how can we come together in spaces like this event to create that sort of collective strength where rather than just being invited to the table, how can we create our own table that we then invite people to? And so we can be the sort of the leaders and the people aren't just coming to us, but we're actually giving the information that sort of needs to go out.
Younger generation, how do you be involved and engage with the movement that you were part of creating?
Yeah, my whole thing is that when you want to be good at something, just find someone who is good at that and then do what they do. I do all of this because I was inspired by the work of Bryan Stevenson, the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, whose life story was displayed in the movie Just Mercy featuring Michael B. Jordan. And so I saw the way that Bryan took history and talked about the narratives that we create from it, specifically that, the great evil of American slavery, of lynching, of segregation isn't just that we did those things, it's that we justified them because of this presumption of racial difference. And so I was so impacted by the narrative work I saw him doing that I wanted to try to do that here in Oregon regarding our history. He brought up this untold history of lynching in America, and I'm thinking, why can't we have this more open conversation about our history of Black exclusionary laws in Oregon? Focusing specifically for me, showing the way that Black exclusionary laws evolved from foundation to sundown laws, to the restrictive covenants, to redlining, gentrification, and the displacement that we still have today, showing how it's a through line between all of this, and that the reasons why we have these racial disproportionalities today is because of the legacies of racial injustice that our state has been founded on. And so my advice for young people is just find someone you admire and try and figure out how you can do what they do in your own little community. And so for me, it was seeing what Bryan's done on a national level and doing, how can I do that in my small space? I really just learn about these things and I'm like, how can I tell people? And sometimes just telling other people is enough. And it's that spreading, and you never know who you may impact. I just went around telling people I was going to put a historical marker about lynching in Coos Bay, Oregon. And eventually I found people who could help me. And so very much it's, I believe in, getting out into the world the things that you want to do, and you'll be surprised when you meet people who can help you.
Wow. That's cool. Well, thank you for sharing your
of course.
story, and thank you for willing to do the interview.
The three most important lessons I've learned in my life that I learned from a trip to the South. The first being, it's okay to believe in something, even when you've never seen it before, and that it's okay to see something, even when others don't believe in it. 4 years ago, most people thought I was crazy for thinking I could put a historical marker about lynching in Coos Bay, Oregon. But what Coos Bay taught me is that no matter where you go, you can find enough people who are willing to choose justice, and given the opportunity, it's just a matter of getting them to see where there's been injustice. And the second thing is that it's less about being the right person for the moment as it is about doing the right thing. I was never the right person to do any of this, but by doing those things, I was able to become the right person. And when I was younger, I used to think that it was remarkable people that did remarkable things. But the older I've gotten, the more I've learned that it's remarkable things that make remarkable people. And so the third and most important thing that I tell young people is that it really is just that simple. Don't underestimate your ability to be the change you want to see in this world, because you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things.